Welcome back. This lecture starts a new section of the course. The understanding section of the course gave us a look at the rules that our brains seem to follow. Your brain is led or influenced by framing. It organizes the world with schemas. It activates and uses those schemas largely through analogy, and often only answers a question like the one that is actually being posed by the world. And most of the time, this is a great way to do things. Framing rules are often relevant. Schemas make the world and yourself predictable, knowable. Analogies make your knowledge useful, and heuristics simplify things, usually pretty well. The understanding section was mostly descriptive, an attempt to capture or show what is happening when we think, remember, know, and at least attempt to understand. Ancient philosophy recognized some of the weaknesses we have, and gave us what are still the most powerful thinking tools created by humans: logical rules and the structured thinking that we can build from them. The final section of the course, the judging section, deals with historically brand new tools of probabilistic thinking and the associated philosophy or appropriate stances toward knowledge that probability-informed outlook levels you up to. Because basically, once we have a probabilistic understanding of the world, we are in a new category as a learning machine. These probabilistic thinking tools, or you could call them these judging tools, are necessarily built on a foundation of logic, without which none of our thinking tools would matter. This middle section, the reasoning section, and lecture 5 especially, is where the content of the course moves from, oh wow, that's so cool, I could totally use that, to, oh snap, that's elementary, how have I managed to even function without knowing this? But that question is for a psychology of education class. For this lecture we have selections from Kreeft's Socratic Logic. If you want a logic text, it's the best bang for your buck. And the probability chapter from the recommended course textbook for this class, Psychology of Thinking. This first reasoning lecture covers the backbone of logic as most of us encounter it. Simple, if-then, and syllogistic logic. If you want to handle more than just syllogisms, then you would need to take a couple of steps back and learn a system, one of the symbolic logic systems of rules and notation that an Intro to Logic or Intro to Proofs course would scaffold you through, in the promise that after a few months you would be able to actually apply it to real problems. This course sticks with the challenge of understanding these simple statements and arguments, what are foundational. This will require us to first wake up our system to and force it to actually do some work, which it hates doing. Second, force yourself to take what is in front of you at face value. See the actual claims and content in front of you, which can be difficult to do because we fill in gaps and we bring lots of assumptions to what's in front of us. Then, deduce a specific thing that we have learned, or induce a general rule that we have learned. So let's wake up System 2. Wake up. System 1 was our fast, holistic, associative, intuitive system. It operated by similarity. It drew on personal experience. It reproduces prior solutions. If you've answered a question one way before, you answer it that way a next time, so you don't have to solve it a second time. System 1 saves us work by asking our affective system, does this feel right? And then sometimes it'll do a quick check with System 2. System 2 tends to be pretty lazy, doesn't want to change much, and it would just slow things down if we wanted to change something anyway. So System 2 says, yeah, what System 1 did is probably appropriate most of the time. But when we can wake it up, when we can force it to work, when it does its job, it works by being slow, analytic, rule-based, and deliberative. It operates by manipulating our symbols, our rules, drawn from language, drawn from culture, from analogies, proverbs, case studies, all that is relevant, produces strategic formal analysis, and since it has to be put together in a coherent system where the reasoning for a solution is traceable, you can justify it. System 2 requires self-control. One of the biggest brains in cognitive psychology, Professor U of T Keith Stanovich, he's also our Canada Research Chair in Cognitive Psych, refers to the decision to use System 2 as heuristic override. So are we just going to rubber stamp the quick and dirty thing that System 1 offered up? Or are we actually going to put together a slow piece-by-piece analysis? In which case, we're going to override the automatic System 1, take ourselves off autopilot, and put in the work of actually understanding what's in front of us and finding justifiable solutions. Fortunately, System 1 can't be shut off. I don't know what our thinking would look like if we could shut it off, but we can't shut it off. So we can't get rid of whatever biases or shortcuts System 1 wants us to use. All those heuristics, they're still going to operate. It takes more than just awareness of the fact that first impressions, availability, representativeness influences us. These are going to operate whether we're aware of them or not. There's nothing tricky about having an abstract knowledge of how messy your System 1 is. What we need, what it takes to improve our thinking, is a deliberate application of System 2 tools. Most of the time we don't have the time to be patient or reasonable, but having an excuse doesn't make the problem go away. And it certainly doesn't make our System 1 thinking logical. Until you map it out deliberately, you should not say it's logical, regardless of how convincing a solution, interpretation, or course of action seems to you. Until you've done the work, you shouldn't apply the label logical. Your relevant System 2 tools are formal logic, such as argument mapping, as we'll be getting into, scientific methods, such as testing your premises, propositions with predictions, or comparing performance of two different interpretations across time, and especially when evaluating claims, having standards of judgment. How rigorous is the test to see whether this person is a witch or not? Is that rigorous enough? It's not just the professional skeptics who should have standards. We should all have standards for what we let ourselves believe and accept of the world. Earlier, I made the statement, without logic, none of our thinking tools would matter. Surely, though, that's an exaggeration. Well, let's look at the favorite, reductio. Take something seriously and show it to be fallacious by deriving a contradiction from it. A heavy ball would fall both faster and slower if you tied a lighter ball to it if we believed that heavy balls fell faster than small balls. That's a contradiction. Now imagine you're speaking with someone who doesn't mind contradictions. If you don't mind the contradiction, then a reductio has no force. There'd be no point to this thinking tool. There'd be no use for it. Well, how about probabilistic tools then? Things like statistics that could be seen as better than the stodgy old Aristotelian logic. Okay, my stats show that in this region where toxic waste was dumped, we have 4-fold increases in cancer. If we allow a counterpoint to be made that maybe some of the people diagnosed with cancer are cases between cancer and non-cancer, or maybe they both have and don't have cancer. So we're violating the most basic rules of logic that I don't even have to explain to you. Identity and the law of the excluded middle. Maybe a diagnosis of cancer need not be interpreted as a case of cancer. In other words, if we do not have the basic tools of logic as a starting point for understanding, none of the other tools matter. So let's get our feet wet with some logic to introduce us to logic, or the framework or mindset or mood feel of logic. Consider this question. If you have 3 apples, do you have 1 apple? Take a second to think and then write down your answer. Type it, make it visible somewhere. In classroom, some students answer no, and they say, you have 3, not 1. Some students answer yes and say you have 1 and 1 and 1 because you have 3. You can't have 3 without having 1. You have your 3 ones. And those who answered no are applying a rule that will serve them well in many conversations. They're assuming that do you have 1 apple means do you have only 1 apple. It's kind of a polite or charitable cardinality assumption. Those who answered yes, you have 1 if you have 3, are applying a rule that will serve them well in logic and reasoning. Look at and deal with what is actually there, what was actually stated. What was actually stated is if you have 3, do you have 1? What the students who answered no are doing is they're adding in an extra word. They're filling in a blank that isn't actually a blank. They're saying, if you have 3, do you have only 1? I've had students get visibly upset and argumentative over the simple observation that having 3 of something means you have 1 of them. We're more familiar and comfortable with different ways of stating these things. Nobody gets upset when we say, you need to have 1 in order to have 3. Obviously, there's nothing upsetting about that. Or, if you have a sister and a brother, then you have a brother. Well, yeah, obviously. Yet, the if you have 3, you have 1 statement leads to accusations of sophistry on my part. Oh, you tricked me. Well, don't shoot the messenger or the logician. If you have three, then you have one. Obviously, if you have three, then you don't have only one. But if, in a logical circumstance, somebody wants to say only one, then they had better say only one. The earlier that students can kind of get over the fact that their initial habit of filling in blanks might be wrong in a logical context, the sooner they'll be ready to pick up and carry the burden of System 2 thinking, of taking things seriously, applying rules, and actually engaging in the reasoning that our education has taught us to pretend that we engage in. If you are in a university-level course, then your experience in pretending to reason logically has likely been so successful and rewarded that you may actually be convinced that your thinking is logical. Our thinking itself is not logical. Nobody's is, but the thinking tools of logic are. And when we apply them, when we can trace our argument, map it out, then that thinking, that traceable logic, is indeed logical thinking. If this lecture accomplishes nothing other than getting you to restrict the descriptor logical to instances where you put in the work to actually mapping the argument or the reasoning out, giving you a standard for using that word, logical, then it will be worth the price of admission. Some basics. First, logic is the structure of reasoning. Philosophers tell the story like this. Regardless of what you are reasoning about, that reasoning follows a form that has been observed by philosophers around the globe, separately in different places, for millennia. A famous boast of philosophers of logic is that those who disparage logic have pretty much no chance of convincing others without, you guessed it, using logic. While I agree in principle, the pragmatic question for a scholar of psychology is, would we have to use logic correctly in order to convince someone of something like the invalidity of logic? So to convince the logic professor, maybe we would have to dot our I's and cross our T's. But to convince the rest of the world, the rest of us would likely be convinced by something that looks logical or feels like it follows a path of reason. So, long story short, in my view, logic is the structure of all good reasoning, and the apparent structure of everything we would call or think is reasonable. So in any case, you would have to invoke logic, regardless of what you were doing. If you want to convince people of something, of the truth of something. You can force somebody to say something is true by holding a gun to their head. We're talking about persuasion to knowledge. Can you get somebody to think that something is actually true? You would need logic or the appearance of logic to have taken hold. The best way is to get people to fill in the logical gaps themselves. But in any case, that which is reasonable is logical, is at least apparently justified by a structure of beliefs other than the thing that we have determined by this structure is reasonable. This structure is premises with a conclusion on top. The typical image of a logical argument is with premises as pillars that hold up the conclusion. In a nutshell, a conclusion must be derived from its premises. You can't rest something on nothing. Hey, would you believe that splebs have no flurbans? They don't have any flurbans. On what could I possibly rest that belief if I chose to believe it? I don't know what splebs or flurbans are. I'm not going to hold that to be reasonable. I have nothing to rest it on. Next, logic is deductive, which tends to be summarized as moving from general or broad truths to truths about specific observations, or it is inductive, which tends to be summarized as moving from specific cases, and from these cases building general rules or even laws that you follow. As we will see, a more concise and useful distinction between deductive and inductive reasoning from another U of T professor, Ian Hacking, is that deductive arguments result in certainty about their conclusions when the argument is sound. That is, when the premises are true and the conclusion follows from them. Whereas inductive reasoning must always admit some uncertainty about its conclusions, even when the premises are true and the conclusion follows from them. Credit to David Hume and Sir Karl Popper for pointing this out. Fourth, terms are either clear or unclear. A term is any thing that needs to be specified in the discussion. On this slide, the first point, logic is the structure of reasoning, contains a subject, logic, and a predicate, is the structure of reasoning. If either of these terms are unclear, causing you to ask, what are we talking about when we say logic? Or what does structure of reasoning mean? Then it will be difficult to reason about them together because we may be referring to or thinking of different things. Of course, we can never think exactly the same thing, but we need to get on the same page enough that we understand each other. The requirement that terms be clear is one of the reasons why logic courses often feel so alienated and unrelated to the real world. Most terms we care about are unclear, and we're often talking to each other as a way to come to terms, put that in quotes, come to terms with that lack of clarity. If one person believes that the term abortion refers to murder and another believes that it refers to feminine hygiene, they're likely going to have quite different ideas about whether abortion is, justified in a given context. Note that terms are clear or unclear. So what in the first point on this slide I mean by logic is either clear or unclear. The term logic, though, is not itself true or false. It's just either clear or unclear what I mean by logic. It is propositions that are either true or false. So anything I propose about logic could be either true or false. Logic itself is either clear or unclear. And that could serve as a kind of minimalist definition of what a proposition is. It's something that can be either true or false. We could consider this a rule because then anything sufficiently vague or so inscrutable as to not be clear enough to be true or false wouldn't count as a proposition. So here's a proposition. Exercise is good for health. This could be either true or untrue. And whether it's true or untrue could depend on what the terms mean. So you have the subject, exercise. What do we mean by exercise? And then you have the predicate, is good for health. Well, what does is good for health mean? What your terms mean will determine whether your proposition is true or false, or whether it even counts as a proposition. Another, walking is exercise. So now we have two propositions, and maybe we can derive from these two propositions a third proposition, a third thing that could be either true or false. Therefore, walking is good for health. Now, this is a conclusion, but it's still a proposition. It's still just a statement. It can be either true or false. Another definition that's sometimes given for proposition is a declarative sentence. So, since these are all propositions, we must have more specific vocabulary to deal with how the third proposition is derived from the first two. The first two propositions here are premises. A premise is a reason that you give for a conclusion. Why should I think, or why do you think, that walking is good for health? Well, exercise is good for health, and walking is exercise. That's why I think walking is good for health. The premises are my reasons for my conclusion, which is a proposition or a statement based on reasons. Now, if you have at least two propositions and a conclusion, then you have an argument, which in logic is reasons presented in order to support a conclusion. Note that an argument is therefore not a disagreement, and it's not just a statement of a fact, i.e. it's not just a conclusion asserted or presented on its own. An argument is statements in support of a conclusion and that conclusion. If you're missing either, then you have no argument.
Well, an argument's not the same as contradiction.
Can be.
No, it can't. An argument's a connected series of statements to establish a definite proposition.
No, it isn't.
Yes, it is. It isn't just contradiction.
Look, if I argue with you, I must take up a contrary position.
But it isn't just saying no, it isn't.
Yes, it is.
No, it isn't.
So let's take our typical first step into logic. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. In red, we have the major premise. It holds the major term, which is the conclusion's predicate. The claim about the subject in the conclusion that is being made. Socrates is mortal. The major term is the conclusion's predicate. In purple, we have the minor premise. Socrates is a man. The minor premise holds the minor term, which is the conclusion's subject, Socrates. Note that the major premise and the minor premise have a term in common. If they didn't, we wouldn't be able to derive anything necessarily from putting them next to each other. Now recall that propositions are just declarative statements, things that could be true or false. Logic files down propositions neatly into one of four types. There are universal negative propositions, no X are Y, no birds are fish, not a single one. There are universal affirmatives, all X are Y, all men are mortal. There are particular negatives, some X are not Y. Some birds are not able to fly. And finally, there are particular affirmatives. Some X are Y. Some propositions are particular affirmatives. I present them to you in this order because there is only one possible Euler diagram that can depict a universal negative. There are two possible Euler diagrams to depict a universal affirmative. There are three possible Euler diagrams to depict any particular negative. And there are four different ways to visualize with Euler circles a particular affirmative. When you order them this way, you can use the first letters of each term to form a mnemonic acronym, UNAWAPNPA. In the Kreeft reading, each of these propositional types, universal negative, universal affirmative, particular negative, and particular affirmative, are denoted by a letter, by a vowel. So you have proposition type E for universal negative, A for universal affirmative, O for particular negative, and I for particular affirmative. This is just how it's been done since Aristotle's day. If use of those vowels confused you in the reading, here's what they mean. These are the four forms of propositions. UNAWAPNPA, or as I like to say, UNAWAPNPAPA. Why do I say that? Stay tuned. Here's the Euler circle diagram that represents a universal negative. No A are B. No birds are fish. Check it out. We have one circle representing all birds, and we have one circle representing all fish. No birds are fish. There's no overlap. Nothing's happening here. There isn't a second way to interpret a universal negative. Or at least there's no other correct way to interpret a universal negative. So there's un. What's happening with uwa? Well, uwa, a universal affirmative, can be depicted in two different ways. If I say that all A are B, such as all men are mortal, well, it could be the case that men are only a subset of mortal things. That is, the category B, mortal things, is larger than the category men, in which case the diagram on the left is the one I would use. So all A is subsumed entirely within B, so all men are indeed mortal, but all men do not fill up the entire category of mortal things. But what the Euler circle on the right depicts is if men were indeed the entirety of the set of mortal things. If all I know is that all men are mortal, well, it might be the case that nothing else is mortal. I don't know. So there are, therefore, two ways to map a universal affirmative. That's our uwa, a universal affirmative proposition, which, in your Kreeft reading and in most classical logic textbooks, is depicted as form A. How about pun? There are three possible ways to map or illustrate correctly a particular negative. So some A are not B. Some birds are not flyers. Now what we tend to picture is the one on the upper right here. B is things that fly, lots of things fly, and A is birds. And some of the birds overlap with the B because they're flyers, and some of them don't overlap with B. So some don't fly and some do. But our natural tendency to assume that some means some and not all could get us into trouble. Because if all we know is that some A are not B, some birds don't fly, we don't get to, in logic, say that some necessarily means some and not all. We don't get to fill it in like that. So if we know some A are not B, it might be the case that all A are not B. Because if all A are not B, well then it's sure that some A are not B. That's what's depicted at the bottom. Some A are not B, and in fact, all A aren't B. So it's possible that when some birds are flightless, if that's all we know about birds, that some of them don't fly, it could be that all of them don't fly. Since the example could be a bit distracting, let's put it this way. Some birds are not 900-foot-tall robots from the future. So some birds are not 900-foot-tall robots from the future. I know that some birds are not 900-foot-tall robots from the future. And if that's all I know, it may be the case that No birds are 900-foot tall robots from the future. When the simple statement is just some A are not B, it may be that all A are not B. In that case, it would still be true that some A are not B. Just like when you have 3, you have 1. The upper left depicts the situation where all B happen to be A, but not all A are B. So in this world, the only things that fly are birds, but not all birds fly. Or, taking up our other example, all 900-foot tall robots from the future are birds, but not all birds are 900-foot tall robots from the future. Three different ways to map a particular negative. When you're dealing with a particular negative, some A are not B. 3 possible truths or instantiations of reality which could lie behind this particular negative. Finally, and most potentially complexly, we have a particular affirmative proposition which can be depicted in 4 ways. There are 4 accurate ways to depict the reality which lies behind a particular affirmative statement. Some B are A. Some propositions are particular affirmative propositions. So once again, our typical way of conceptualizing this or visualizing it would probably be the upper right. Some B are A. There's some overlap here. But recalling what we had to do for the universal affirmative, it may be true that if some B are A, then all B are A. Because if all B were A, well then some B would be A. But of course, if all B were A, it might be the case that there are more A than there are B. We know it's not the case for our example. Our example is some propositions are particular affirmative propositions. It's not the case that particular affirmatives outnumber propositions, but it shouldn't be too hard to think of an example for which this diagram is appropriate. If I say some songs are hilarious, the category of hilarious things is larger than the category of songs. And if it was also the case that all songs are hilarious, then that would be depicted with the lower right diagram. This leaves us with the upper left, which incidentally is the diagram that we need to properly map our original particular affirmative example, which was some propositions are particular affirmatives. This is the one that captures the actual reality, because no particular affirmatives would fall outside of the proposition bubble. So for B, we have all propositions, and for A, we have all particular affirmative propositions. So some propositions, B, are particular affirmatives, A, and in this case, all particular affirmatives, A, are propositions, B. The inconvenience of having to jump between examples in order to illustrate all 4 Euler diagrams for particular affirmative illustrates why logic courses tend to be rather abstract and dry, because any given example that you use in order to flesh things out necessarily refers to a particular instantiation of reality, i.e. only one of the diagrams. But the important point for logic is that if the proposition is that some B are A, that brings up 4 possible realities behind that proposition. Important for interpreting our particulars is that the word some in logic refers to at least some and maybe even all. Some does not mean only some but not all, which is what we commonly take it to mean in conversation. What about the extra syllable here? The extra pa? Well, the extra syllable is for the high five you should give yourself if you've spent enough time in System 2 that you actually understand these diagrams. High pa, everybody. If you don't like the Anuap and Papa mnemonic, then that's fine. You don't have to like it or use it. It's just what I came up with to make it easy for me to recall things in lecture, especially when students come up with random examples that they want me to diagram, so I thought I'd share it with y'all. Okay, but let's say I want to apply logic in the wilds of Canada, in reality. But this is what I'm up against. These are the arguments that people present. Other kids have iPhones, and I really want one. Therefore, I should have an iPhone. Well, this isn't an argument. You'll note that there are 2 propositions, followed by a 3rd proposition, that the speaker is somehow implying flows or follows from the first 2 propositions. But the conclusion doesn't actually follow. It takes a lot of charitability and filling in blanks in order to get this into an argumentative form. There are, in fact, 2 arguments, each being incomplete. So other kids have iPhones. This is a premise of a first argument. And I really want one is the premise of a second different argument. If we want to make sense of the statements actually being presented to us, we need to fill in plenty of gaps in this argument. Strictly speaking, the other kids have iPhones statement is a minor premise. And there is a hidden major premise, which is I should have what other kids have. Yes, that's the major premise because we see its major term show up in the predicate of the conclusion, i.e. this is where I should have comes from. So other kids have iPhones, and I should have what other kids have, therefore I should have an iPhone. Now that we've made the argument clear, I'm free to question, child, whether you indeed should have what other kids have. Because if that's not the case, i.e. if that proposition or premise does not hold, then your conclusion does not hold. And kids, just like academics, are very good at burying their weak but necessary premises. The second argument that the child was putting forward, which, by the way, like the first, is an enthymeme, a syllogism with an unstated premise, a premise that we just assume will be held in everyone's mind. The second argument, again, was only shown in its minor premise. I really want an iPhone. What is the major premise, or what must be the major premise, if we are to conclude from this minor premise that they should have an iPhone? The major premise is I should have what I want. This is the premise that the child meant to reason from but did not state. Its predicate, i.e. the major term, is the predicate of the conclusion. I should get an iPhone. Now that all of the premises of the argument are actually out in the open, we can address them. Is it really the case, child, that you should get that which you want? If we can agree to that, then we can agree that it follows that your wanting an iPhone warrants you getting one. One of the reasons why nobody has time to actually be reasonable with other people, i.e. to evaluate the arguments they're presenting, is that they're not presenting their full arguments. They're assuming we hold a lot of their premises already in our mind. They're making enthymetic arguments based on shared beliefs, values, and the further they are from us in terms of these things, the less we understand what they could possibly mean, the more we need to spend time coming to terms and making explicit enthymetic premises. Aside from a lack of clarity, there are two things that could go wrong with an argument. You could have premises that are false. So maybe you don't actually deserve to get everything that you want, for example. The second thing that could go wrong is maybe you have a conclusion that doesn't follow from the reasons, or from the premises. This certainly would have been the case for the child arguing for an iPhone if we hadn't filled in the missing enthymetic premises. We could have just said, well, you don't have an argument, child. You haven't specified two connected premises from which a conclusion results. Now, in logic, we are not actually dealing with judgment. We are not actually dealing with whether premises are true or false. Logic is the structure for figuring out whether conclusions follow from premises, according to rules. Whether those premises are true or not is a task for epistemology, aesthetics, democracy. Logic helps with the process of reasoning, but not with the truth of its contents. Logic is about whether your conclusion follows from your premise. I want one, and I should have what I want, therefore I should have one. Is this a sound argument? Well, it's sound if it's valid and the premises are true. Logic tells us it's valid, judgment tells us whether it's sound. So let's split reasoning into deductive and inductive. If a conclusion must be true, if the premises are true and its form is valid, then this argument is a deductive one. This argument is without risk. If it is in fact true that all men are mortal, and if it is in fact true that Socrates is a man, it is 100% true that Socrates is mortal. True premises and valid form mean a definitely true conclusion. Let's say I reason thusly. My wallet is either in my pocket or it's lost. Let's be true logicians and say, I accept this. I accept that there are only two possible realities, and these two possible realities are your wallet is in your pocket or it's lost. Now let's say I check my pocket and it's not there. I conclude that my wallet is lost. And this is a deductive task because I set the world up as having only two possibilities. And as long as these are the only possibilities, if I rule one out, then the other is certain, according to my rules. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is our categorical syllogism. As Kreeft advises, we draw the major premise first. All men are mortal. Now there was a second way to draw this, which was to say that men compose all mortal creatures. But let's just draw it the way we know it is. We have mortal creatures, and then men are subsumed entirely in mortal creatures. So far as we know, there are no immortals amongst us. Now let's draw the minor premise. Socrates is a man. There he is. Well, I can conclude with certainty that Socrates is a mortal creature. Since no portion of Socrates is outside of the man circle, no portion of Socrates is outside of the immortal creatures circle. We could use Euler's circles for the other argument as well. I should have all that I want, and I want an iPhone, therefore I should have an iPhone. Draw the major premise first. All things that I want are entirely subsumed within all things that I should have, and it just so happens, according to my minor premise, that one of the things I want is an iPhone. It appears that I should have an iPhone. But of course we scaffolded this child's reasoning for him. What if we hadn't? What if we had not filled in the implied premise, the major premise that said the child should have what it wants? Well then, what the child wants is not necessarily subsumed within what the child should have. So the predicate of the conclusion is just kind of floating around. The child has not established that it should in fact have an iPhone. And I drew the major premise here as a particular affirmative, but that was an arbitrary choice. So as we learned, two things can go wrong with an argument. The reasons could be false, or the conclusion might not follow from them. Here's why logic, with its inability to judge the premises, is just a tool in need of an intelligent wielder. Here is an example from Christian Science, which only Google it if you want to feel sad. Major premise: all disease is caused by belief. Minor premise: measles is a disease. Conclusion: therefore measles is caused by belief. This is impeccable reasoning. It is valid. You have a major premise whose major term is properly the predicate of the conclusion, a minor premise whose subject, measles, is the subject of the conclusion. The major and minor premise have a term in common, i.e. disease. It follows validly from the reasoning that measles is in fact caused by belief. In other words, this is logical, because logic only deals with whether the conclusions follow from the premises, i.e. it deals in validity. It does not deal in judgment, i.e. the determination of the truth of premises. What about the other problem, the fact that the conclusion might not follow from the premises? Well, let's say that everyone who is 6'3" is a robot. That has the appearance of a major premise. Now let's also say Brian likes candy. Alright, sounds like a pretty good minor premise. It's just not a good minor premise for the major premise because they don't have a term in common. If these two things have nothing in common, then you can't derive something from them. So what could the conclusion possibly be? Therefore, we are in Canada. But wait, shouldn't this be about robots? This conclusion doesn't follow. But wait, it's true. We are in Canada. So the conclusion is true, but the argument is invalid. You don't even have an argument here. So this should help to drive home the idea that logic doesn't care about the truth of premises or propositions. It cares about whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. So for fun, let's try to map this out. Everyone who's 6'3" is a robot. Brian likes candy. Therefore, we are in Canada. Well, rule number one, start by mapping the major term. All right, major term. Everyone who's 6'3" is a robot. I'm going to assume there are also robots who are not people who are 6'3", so I'm going to use this particular instantiation of the universal affirmative. Here's my major premise. Mapped. So far, so good. Looks like we're going to do some logic. People who are 6'3" are all robots. And Brian likes candy. Crap, where do I put this? Brian liked candy. Just kind of floating out there. And how would I derive the conclusion, therefore we're in Canada? How do I get, therefore we're in Canada, from any of this? I have no instructions for how these things are related to each other. Just a big mess of invalidity. Logic only deals with whether conclusions follow from premises, i.e. it only deals with validity. It does not determine truth. Regardless of what's true, an argument is either valid or invalid. The conclusion follows or it does not. My house is in Canada. I'm in my house. Therefore, I'm in Canada. Here, I can map this. And the major term is the predicate of the conclusion. Is in Canada. Am in Canada. The major premise and the minor premise have a term in common. My house. And the subject of the minor premise, I, me, is the subject of the conclusion. So it follows all the rules, which is wonderful. And when it does so, it is mappable or diagrammable. First map the major premise. My house is in Canada. Then the minor premise, I am in my house. Wonderful. Why is this important? Why do we need to go over the rules of deductive logic? Because we make appeals to them without following them. This is called failure to accept the logical task, or FALT. In studies where we train people specifically in how to understand a specific type of syllogism, and then get them right away to assess the very type that we just trained them in, they will fail to accept the logical task most of the time, i.e. they will judge the syllogism based on how they feel about its contents, and dutifully report to us that they applied the rules, which, if they had applied them, they would come to the opposite conclusion that they did regarding validity and invalidity. In other words, research participants made a judgment based on their feelings, but reported using formal reasoning. The interesting thing about failing to accept the logical task is that most of the time our feelings are a fine guide to whether something is true or reasonable in a given context. So failing to accept a logical task in the context of reality doesn't hold much penalty. In fact, the time we save by not evaluating things logically slowly with our System 2 is probably of far more benefit to us in the long run than the few decisions we would have gotten correct if we'd kicked into System 2 rather than stayed in System 1. This fact, the fact that we can usually get away with not actually thinking or reasoning with System 2 about what is being said, is called the fundamental paradox of rationality, i.e. the fact that most of the time we don't need to be rational to end up with the rational conclusion. This is how good System 1 is. Alright, more logic in the wild. Here's something that I caught at the in-laws when the television was on a couple of years ago. All NHL teams, this was picture a talking head with a stiff collar, really white teeth, talking very loudly so we take him seriously. All NHL teams improved near the end of the season. Alright, fine. That's a fine thing to say, I guess. The Maple Leafs are an NHL team. He didn't explicitly say this. This was an anthematic premise. Therefore, he concluded, the Leafs will win more of their end-of-season games. So the only reason he gave for saying that the Leafs are going to win more of their end-of-season games was that NHL teams, all NHL teams, tend to improve near the end of the season. Now, most of you have probably smelled that something is wrong with this statement, or with this argument. So let's evaluate this by the book. You have your major premise, which should map via the major term to the conclusion. So you should see the predicate of the conclusion in the major premise. But in the conclusion we have will win more of their end-of-season games, whereas in the major premise all we had was improve. And improve and win more are not necessarily the same thing. If we replace the win more in the conclusion with improve, then we have a nice valid deductive syllogism. And it would look like this: that which improves at the end of the season, all NHL teams improve near the end of the season. The Leafs, being an NHL team, will improve at the end of the season. But instead of that being the case, we have equivocation or ambiguity between the major premise, or the major term, and what is written in the conclusion. For fun, let's see what would happen if we put the predicate from the conclusion into the major premise. All NHL teams will win more of their end-of-season games. If we did that, we would once again have a valid deductive syllogism. All NHL teams win more of their end-of-season games. The Maple Leafs are an NHL team, therefore the Maple Leafs will win more of their end-of-season games. The trouble with that is, not all teams can win more of their end-of-season games. That is not how sport works. Anywhere there is more wins, there are more losses. So let's look at the three ways that arguments can go wrong. First, are the terms all clear and unambiguous? No, you have equivocation and ambiguity regarding the major term. What if we got rid of the ambiguity? Well, it would depend on how we got rid of the ambiguity. If we just stuck with improve as the major premise, that would probably be fine, because improve could mean many things. Teams maybe play harder near the end of the season, maybe more goals are scored overall by both teams, maybe the trade deadline creates synergy or motivates players or something. But we know that if we fix the ambiguity by making the major premise will win more of their end of season games, then we have a definitely false major premise. Not all NHL teams win more games at the end of the season. But if we didn't do any charitable work whatsoever, if we didn't work to make the major premise clear, we would be left with just interpreting things at face value. All NHL teams improve near the end of the season. The Maple Leafs are an NHL team, therefore the Leafs will win more of their end-of-season games. That's just invalid because the conclusion brings in something not stated in the premises, i.e. specifically winning more. So I might agree with this sports commentator that the Leafs will improve near the end of the season, and do so because of his reasoning. But that's the only charitable version of this argument that I see as reasonable. Let's look at another example where the conclusion doesn't follow from the reasons. Here's a cartoon. Penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Now you might recognize this from the last lecture as reasoning by analogy. We can see pretty quickly if we try to diagram this that we're specifically not given any reason to think that penguins and old TV shows overlap. There's no overlap established here between penguins and old TV shows. We have properly put them within the general category of things that are black and white, but nothing has established penguins overlap with old TV shows. Deduction doesn't give us any information we don't already somehow possess in our premises, which are proof. But it helps us to find what we already believe or know, and maybe test, in the reductio sense of test, our knowledge and our beliefs, to see what we actually believe. Sometimes we surprise ourselves because we turn out to have all we need to solve a problem that we didn't know we could solve, or we turn out to have knowledge required to prove ourselves wrong in one area that we just hadn't decided to apply to that area yet. An example of realizing that we believe something we didn't know we believed. The Lord is just. Do we believe the Lord is just? The Lord will send non-believers to hell, or a lake of fire. Okay, therefore it's just that non-believers go to hell. Okay, first map the major premise. With Euler's circles. All that the Lord does is just. A universal affirmative, which of course there's two ways to map it, but let's map it this way, since there could be just things not done by the Lord. And now the minor premise, one of the things that the Lord does is send non-believers to hell. So apparently we believe that it's just that people go to hell. Alright, fine. Let's turn the dials on this a little bit more. This is Karen. Karen is a non-believer. She doesn't believe. So let's throw Karen in the mix. We're breaking one of Aristotle's rules here, but let's throw Karen in the mix, sending doubters to hell. She's a doubter, so she'll get sent to hell. And apparently, since it's something that the Lord does, it is a just thing. Of course, the apologists will say it's Karen that sent herself to hell, it's not the Lord. We still believe that it's just if we believe these other things. Now, I mentioned that we broke one of Aristotle's rules by having more than 3 propositions. So it's technically no longer a syllogism. It is a sorites, i.e. a multiple syllogism argument. God is just, God sends people to hell, it's just that people go to hell. Alright, we already had that one. When we brought Karen in, we were actually bringing in a second syllogism. Doubters go to hell, Karen is a doubter, Karen will go to hell. So you have 2 conclusions, and we turn those conclusions into premises with their own conclusion, i.e. there's actually 3 syllogisms in this sorites. We'll be getting back with much more deductive logic next lecture. For now, we briefly turn to inductive logic. Sometimes a conclusion is just more likely to be true if the premises are true and the logic is valid, i.e. if it's sound. This argument is inductive. In other words, the argument has some risk. True premises and validity here only support a true conclusion. Soundness only supports a true conclusion. So an example induction that you may have made is, last time I cooked this supper dish, it took about 30 minutes to cook. This time it should be similar, so this time it's going to take 30 minutes to cook this dish for supper. You could say I'm inducing or inferring a general rule about how long it takes to cook this dish, and then concluding based on that rule. The classical Socratic categorical syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, in inductive form becomes everyone who has lived so far that we know of has died. You could be more specific and you could say, well, we've never heard of anybody who's lived past 118 or whatever the record lifespan is, but let's not get too technical here. Minor premise, Socrates is alive, therefore Socrates will die. Here we can admit that there may be uncertainty. Back in the day, somebody might have said, what if we discover a magical fountain of youth? Today we might say, well, what if we discover how to keep the body alive forever? With science, maybe Socrates won't die. The fact that we should probably admit that we can't be 100% certain, or we shouldn't, as a learning machine or organism, take 100% certainty as a state of belief, is attributed to Hume. Hume is credited with what's called his problem of induction. Now, this specific statement of the problem comes from Popper, Sir Karl Popper mostly, but here's your problem. Every day the sun rises. Tomorrow will be another day. Therefore, tomorrow the sun will rise. This seems okay until you realize, well, there's kind of an implied premise here that the future is going to be like the past. So, in essence, we're begging the question of whether or not tomorrow will be like the past. In my major premise, every day the sun rises, is my conclusion. Tomorrow the sun will rise. I can't really draw up a prediction about the future without begging the question that the future will be like the past or somehow predictable from the past. So inherent to inductive types of reasoning is that we can't be certain about it, the way we are with deductive kind of toy types of problems. In other words, inductive conclusions are not logical certainties the way deductive conclusions are. Now this bothered Hume, even though Hume wasn't using the word induction. This bothered Hume because he realized that any sane person acts as if they're certain that the sun is going to rise tomorrow, and yet the sober philosopher realizes he cannot be certain in his reasoning that such will be the case. In real life, you've likely made some inductions. If you're a male, you've likely had somebody ask you to open a jar for them. The inductive reasoning might go something like this. Opening jars requires a strong grip. Males can open jars, therefore males have a strong grip. That's why somebody handed you a jar to open, or that's why you handed somebody a jar to open. We make that induction. And turns out, if you measure grip strength, that induction tends to be quite accurate, or what you might call useful. Now, with inductive logic, we are entering into a world of risk and uncertainty, because there are multiple models for how inductive logic works. It's not a neat closed system the way deductive logic at least could potentially be. Many philosophers are not quite sure what you mean when you say inductive logic, because there's a few different systems for it. But let's look at the type of risk we would care about, because, thanks to Hume's problem, even when we have sound logic, true premises and valid conclusions derived from those premises, we still can't be certain about our conclusions. So where does the risk come from? First, things get more risky when we cross category boundaries or when we have more general terms that we're talking about. So, news. The news is trustworthy. This, in front of me right now, is news. Therefore, this is trustworthy. Now, news is a very broad category, so that may be a bit of a risky proposition. That syllogism would certainly contain more risk than weather news is trustworthy. This is weather news, therefore this is trustworthy. It's more specific. There's a better chance that the specific instance that I am using the general rule to predict will be well predicted because the general rule is itself more specific to that specific instance. Next, things get less risky when we get more data. Compare Monday's forecast was correct, therefore today's forecast will be correct, to last week all 7 forecasts were correct within 4 degrees, therefore today's forecast will be correct within 4 degrees. Or, since last week might have been a particularly easy week to predict the weather for, let's find potentially less biased ways of getting our data. 7 forecasts randomly selected from the last 2 months were all correct within 4 degrees. Therefore, today's forecast will be correct within 4 degrees. Note that there's nothing in the rules of logic that pertains to this risk. We need tools of judgment to evaluate the risk component of our inductive reasoning. The next 2 lectures will cover things like if-then statements, Aristotle's rules, ambiguity, emotion in System 1, and confirmation bias. These are the new concepts introduced in this lecture. There may be a couple here that are relevant or usable for the written assignment, provided you come across in your personal experience a good example of it in something you hear or see in real life, the internet or television, and provided you could interestingly and clearly articulate how the example from your personal experience is a good instance of the concept. There's also some good new concepts from the readings, but all of them happen to be concepts that will be covered in the first half of next lecture, so stay tuned for those. Happy thinking.